appreciate everyone that's come back this afternoon for a study. Chapter 25 is a rather interesting study. It is unfortunately, I think, been relegated to the archives of, or the context of a women's study. When you look at chapter 25 of 1 Samuel and talk about Abigail. I've always resented, to some degree, the fact that, studying Esther or studying Ruth is not a strictly woman's kind of study. It's in the Bible. It's for all of us. And I've seen so many times, ladies' days, where they'll talk about 1 Samuel 25, talk about Abigail. And I don't know, maybe we need to have a men's study sometime, talk about Nabal. I don't know. But regardless, I'm going to look at it a little bit different. I'm going to look at it like David did, okay? David had no problems with his manhood. Look through the middle of this chapter, and I'm going to go through it a little bit, but I want you to note that when Abigail told David, here's what you ought to do, and I just understand this is the wife of the guy that kind of spat on David, and he was going to go thump him, and Abigail came to him and said, I need to make peace here, showing her great wisdom. We'll look at that in a minute, but I want you to notice in verse 35, okay? This is kind of, when I read across this, I said, oh, I know how I want to present this chapter. Because this is a chapter about two people, Abigail and Nabal. And it's a contrast between two types of people. Not a man and woman per se, although it is about a man and woman. But it's about two types of people. One we should not be like, and the other we should emulate. And I'm going to focus mostly on what we should emulate. And that's us men too, because you'll notice David received from her hand what she had brought him. And I guess I ought to set it up by actually what happened. Most of you already know the story of Abigail. She is married to a scumbag. And this guy was just an evil guy. And the Bible tells us he's an evil man. He's a fool. His name means fool, and he lives up to his name. But he's just a horrible person. But anyway, it's about these two people and their interaction with David and how he feels about David. And one, of course, is a contrast of all about me. I think verse 10, before we get to verse 35, verse 10 and 11, he's complaining because he doesn't need to support David, even though David protected him. But he said in verse 11, then notice the personal pronouns. We always do this with the guy that built bigger barns. Well, here's you another one. Look at the personal pronouns. Nabal was all about me. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shares and give it to men when I do not know where they are from? Well, that was not smart, because he knew where David was from. He knew all about him. So did Abigail. But the point is, Nabal was just not a nice guy. And so David was going to go over there and thump him because he needed a little bit of help, and Nabal wasn't there to give it to him. And when Abigail found out, she prepared a peace offering, basically, went to David. And you'll notice in verse 35, David received from her hand what she had brought him, and said to her, go up in peace to your house. Hear this. See, I have heeded your voice and respected your person. I think that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at Abigail, and we're going to heed her voice, and we're going to respect her person. Every one of us, not just the ladies. This is a men thing too. But what we're going to look at is several facets or features, and I'm not going to dwell on any. In fact, when I first went into this, I looked back through my 30-something plus years, 40 years of preaching, see how many that I have recorded, because there was a bunch that I have, sermons I've preached that I have not recorded, but I have a list of all the sermons I've done. I bet I have preached, at least the ones I can find, 10 sermons, all different on this chapter. And this one's different than all them. So this is not going to be covered in any depth. In fact, I am henpecking, chicken pecking, just picking certain things out of it that I want to point out. But I want to look at Abigail's character as opposed to Nabal, who is a drunken fool and is all about me. Now, he wasn't stupid. Let's understand that. People who are evil and do wrong things, it does not necessarily mean they're not smart. Okay? This man, it says at the very beginning in verse 2, was very rich. You don't get rich by accident. You get rich because you're pretty smart about something. But that doesn't mean you're a good person. And all too often, especially when it comes to leadership in the church, the money that somebody contributes sometimes is very, very important and very valuable and gives them a little notch up. That should not be the case. In fact, we're going to find here that the contrast between this very rich man who had him a wife that was real pretty, but she was a woman of good understanding. That is the polar opposite of what Nabal is. And so the first thing that I would point out about her is that she was a smart lady. She was intelligent. You know, the roles we take sometimes don't really characterize our value well. And we often look down on some people because of the role they take, and we even relegate it to the common sense or the knowledge or the understanding somebody has. There's just the opposite here. We need to be like Abigail. We need to be understanding. One of the reasons I believe she's understanding is explained in the chapter. Notice what happens when Nabal just does a dumb thing and discards the servants of David. Well, somebody, and there's all kinds of implications, I'll just touch on a few, but some fella who was out there herding and knew who David was, came to Abigail to tell her something negative about her husband. Now think about that for a minute. There was some kind of relationship there. There was some kind of an understanding about who Abigail was, that even when the message wasn't going to be pretty, they could go to her, and she was a woman of understanding. She would listen to the information. She was an informed person. As a matter of fact, a little later on, talking about David, she goes up to David, and she says in verse 28, look at that one, "For the Lord will certainly make my Lord an enduring house, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord, and evil is not found in you throughout all your days." She knows who David is. This woman is informed. One of the foundational, I think, characteristics that Christians should have in order to be the kind of people we need to be, God's people, is to be informed. If we don't spend our time knowing not just the Bible, and I say that like that's not important, but that's misconstrued. No, that's the first and the basic part of it. You got to know your Bible. But we got to know our neighbors. We got to know what's going on in town, in the county, in the country. We need to be in touch with the culture within which we live. If we're going to be effective in trying to convert people, we need to be a person of good understanding. That woman had a sense of what was going on politically. She had a sense of what was going on within the cadre of her own company. That man went to her knowing, I can talk to this lady. She's not going to blow a fuse and be unreasonable like Nabal. She's going to listen because she's a woman of understanding. To me, that's one of the highest compliments you can give somebody, is that they are someone of understanding. They are willing to take in information and judge it objectively for the information it is. Because this guy comes in, and what he tells her in verses 14 through 17 is not pretty. Now understand, he's telling this woman who is the wife of the subject. He's telling this woman, your husband's a lout. He's a horrible person. And it's not like it wasn't common knowledge. She knew that. Later on talks about him. And not, by the way, and this is something I think is of import, she is not being disrespectful to Nabal to just say things like they are. Nabal's his name. He's a fool. He's a scoundrel. She was being honest about who her husband was. Now, let's put this in this context also, because in this culture it's likely that Nabal was a bit of an older man and she was quite a younger woman. And that's what happened in these days. You got to where you were established, and once you were established, you married a young woman in order to have offspring and have somebody to inherit all your stuff. And frankly, being rich, it took him a while to get there. So with what he was having and all the sheep, 3,000 sheep and all that kind of stuff, he had quite a bit of wealth for men of that era. And so we still, though, see a young woman, I believe, who was extremely understanding, and she was very wise. You can look at a text like verse 33. Blessed is your advice, and blessed are you, because you have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed and from avenging myself with my own hand. Now this is where it's stated by inspiration that David was about to make a mistake, and he was smart enough to listen to this young woman. Part of the reason, I think, was the way she presented herself. One of the things that impresses me about Abigail, which we should take care of like that, is when there is a job to be done, you get it done. And you don't dally about. You'll notice in verse 18, when When Abigail hears the message that is given her, it's not a positive message, but what it is impetus to get a job done. She knew she had to do something, and it says, then Abigail made haste. It's like when something needs to be done, you don't dally about, you get it done. Same kind of thing happens when she sees David. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey and fell on her face before David and bowed down to the ground. She immediately, in verse 23, went and did immediately what needed to be done in the moment. Part of the fact that she was an understanding woman, I think, included the fact she understood when a precedent is about to take place, you got to get it done in a timely fashion. You got to take care of business when it needs to be taken care of. And so that's what Abigail does. I think, too, being informed, being focused, one of the most stellar features, characteristics of Abigail is her humility. Now, you ought to understand in this context, too, women were basically chattel property. They were not considered at all equal with men, but she did not have to choose to present herself certain ways. The two that really strike me is in verse 28, that's the first one. When she goes, now this is all because of Nabal. Remember that. Nabal is the idiot. He's the one who has created the entire scenario. She's trying to diffuse it, okay? So how do you approach it? Well, the first thing you do is you go up and you go, oh, it's all my husband's fault and I can't do anything about it, but here's some food. No, quite the contrary. Please forgive, listen to this, the trespass of your maidservant. Where in the world did she get that? She understood who she was and what her position was, and she understood that I am this man's wife. I have a loyalty to him, even if he's a fool. By the way, that's a great lesson, ladies, okay? Don't dish your husband. I don't care if he is a fool. Look at Abigail. None of us are Nabals, okay? We're pretty bad, but none of us are Nabals. But wives, you need to understand from Abigail, this is a great way to be toward your husband. The reality of it is your husband is who your husband is. But there is still a level of respect where she understood, I'm connected to my husband. I'm a part of whatever goes on. You know, if only Sapphira had figured that out. You go to the New Testament, you know, Ananias and Sapphira pulled a sneaky on Peter, or thought they did, and Ananias dropped dead, and right behind Sapphira comes in, and what she should have done was say, you know, my husband and I cooked this up, and this isn't right, and I shouldn't do this. She didn't. Okay? Abigail was a step better than that. I'm going to fix this, and we'll find out later how wise she was about how she did it. But notice, too, in verse 41, and this is after Nabal kicks the bucket. God, in fact, it says God took him. It's right after his drunk fest. God caused Nabal to die. David, with all of his honor, and because he understood this is an understanding woman, it says he sent messages to her, and David says, hey, Abigail, since you haven't got a husband anymore, I want to make you my wife. Notice the humility in her, even her acceptance of going from one man to another and being in submission and being in that culture where she is almost going to be treated like child property, and yet look at her attitude. She arose, bowed her face to the earth, and said, here is your maidservant, note this, a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. It's just hard to find something more humble than that. An individual who is all about, let's be the servant that I should be. And so Abigail shows us this, but also Abigail, she was wise. She just handled things well. I mean, some of the indicators of that is in verse 36. You know, there is a time when we should speak to our loved ones, and then there's a time where we ought to keep our mouth shut, okay? And the discretion between the two is quite delicate, and sometimes very hard to understand, very hard to break it in. But Abigail, in verse 36, went to Nabal, so she came back from giving all this gift to David to keep her husband from getting killed. She goes over to talk to Nabal, and there he was, holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. Nabal's heart was merry within him because he was very drunk. And, you know, I don't know why. It's kind of like a rabid dog. You don't reason with a rabid dog, you shoot it. It's just kind of the same thing with a drunk. You don't sit down and try to be logical and reasonable with a drunk. When I was in the Navy, I found that the best thing to do for a guy that came in and was boisterous and getting in trouble and being conflictual, and he's been out on all night drunk, the best medicine was a tube for it right across the head. Solved all the problems. You don't sit and reason with the guy because he's not going to reason. There is no reason in drunkenness. She's so wise, therefore she told him nothing, little or much, until morning light. I love the way that's stated. Didn't say a word. Why? Wasn't the right time. She is very wise in the way in which she chooses to do the things that she is doing. And she's so wise that even David sees it, and I mentioned verse 35 a while ago. I've heeded your voice, David said, and I've respected your person. That's a very interesting phrase there in Hebrew, talking about the idea that you are somebody. You're elevated in my view. It's kind of an interesting way of putting it. I've respected your person. You have a value to you that goes beyond what others around have as value. And so when I look at this, this is not just for women. This is for people who want to be better, who want to be more godly, who want to understand it particularly, and this is a kick I've been on here lately. I wrote an article here recently about being a servant. We are about servanthood. And this is a lady who understands her role and is not devalued because her role may be submissive to someone else. She doesn't, bark and fuss for equality and all that kind of nonsense. She realizes where she is where God has put her and where she can do the best. And she goes beyond the mold to do that very thing. There's a lot of characters in the Old Testament where we kind of pigeonhole sometimes, I think. I'd invite you to read the Bible and read about these Old Testament individuals especially, who usually we see the mainstream place them in a particular box, and we are very comfortable with our boxes. Let's put them in this box, and we got the perimeter of cardboard around them, and they don't get out much. That's not the way to view these people. Look at them as a whole, and look at what they can contribute to you and I, because every word in this book is for us. And you can look at it, you and I, and we can be better children of God for understanding how she conducted herself. I can't think of a better way to commend somebody than to say, I respect your person. And that's what King David did with Abigail. And he was not a dummy, because when they will kick the bucket, he was not lax and running over and grabbing up a smart woman, because they are such a benefit to a husband who needs a smart woman beside him. This did not accommodate an invitation, other than the fact that I invite you to be wise, like Abigail. I invite you to be informed, like Abigail. But specifically, I invite you to be focused and get the job done. Make haste and hurry to be the kind of child of God that you should be. If you want to respond in any way, we offer that response and invitation. Won't you stand together?